All right. We're here with our Ask the Expert. And so we have with us today Dr. Cindy Simon Rosenthal, OU Professor of Political Science Emeritus and former mayor of Norman, Oklahoma. Welcome, Dr. Rosenthal.
Thank you. Glad
All
to be
right.
here.
So today we're going to talk about local government. So we have an expert both in practice and also a professor of political science. So let's jump right in here. So we use the term local government for any government below the state level, but they're really different ones, right? So could you maybe briefly list some of the different kinds of local government?
Sure, and this does tend to vary from state to state, and particularly when it gets to what are called special districts, because some states use them more than others. But I mean, the most obvious ones are the municipal governments, the cities, or in some cases, smaller municipal entities that are called towns. The county, which would be have this occupy the same territory, but a larger territory than the city. The school districts would be another one. Again, in some states and in some cities, a school district is under the municipality, but in Oklahoma, that's not the case. It's a separate district. Then you get regional water districts. Norman was part of a 3-city regional conservancy district to manage its main water supply, Lake Thunderbird. Library system, governing multiple municipalities and counties. In Oklahoma, again, these tend to be tri-county districts. Regional park districts, we didn't have that in Norman, but we did have Norman Regional Hospital Authority, which is a municipal government, but now a separate governing entity, which is responsible for a health system that is not only in Norman, but is in other communities in the Norman region. Most recently in Norman, and that's something that I had an opportunity to be involved in, we created a regional transit authority to bring mass transit, rail, and other forms of intercity transit, bus service, etc., to the region. And we created that regional authority back in 2018 in order to get a system running in the regional Oklahoma City central area. So those are some of the main ones that are out there, that all of which have some interface with city government.
And it can be confusing from a user perspective, right? Because you have build a new library, and that the building might be different than the system, and water coming in is different than water going out.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question. If I used to show students a slide of all the different intergovernmental organizations that were involved in delivering water in the city of Norman, and between federal, state, and local entities and regional entities, I think there were 12 or 15 different governmental entities that were in play there.
All right, you've touched on some of these, but I'll ask, what are the main functions of local government, and how do they differ from maybe state and national government?
Well, I think probably the biggest difference is that local government is all about delivering services. So when you get up in the morning and you turn on your faucet and you flush your toilet and you go out your driveway and get on a public street, you stop at the stop sign or the intersection or walk on the sidewalks, past the parks, going slowly so that the police don't stop you. All of those functions of basic services are provided at the local level. Now, there may be regulatory restrictions that come into play with those, but it's really cities that deliver the day-to-day services that you come to expect in your household and in your local community. So in addition to those fundamentals like the utilities that I mentioned, it's also the case that obviously parks and some of the amenities that go with recreation facilities are also a city function. So all about services, less about policy making in a sort of grand scale, but cities touch your life every day.
So you alluded to this, but are there ways maybe the state government can restrict local governments?
Yeah, so I think that there's sort of a couple of different ways in which, I mean, and we've seen this a lot in Oklahoma in recent years. It started somewhat when I was still mayor in 2014, 15. But um, the state can preempt local government from doing certain things. So we call these, preemption laws. And typically this is where the state government maybe have a different attitude on environmental regulations or things like that. Now, in some states, in Oklahoma, the Constitution does provide for home rule cities, which generally speaking are constitutions at the local level that give cities a lot of authority to make their own decisions. And they are intended not to allow for the state to preempt. But in fact, I mean, the state may be inclined to preempt because of the pressures or the interest groups that operate at a state level. Oklahoma, for example, oil and gas. And preempt a local regulatory effort to protect water from oil and gas operations, as one example. Norman, we had a couple instances where Norman could have challenged some of these preemption laws, but frankly, they're expensive. The litigation takes a long time, and at the end of the day, it was oftentimes not financially worth it. I think the other big thing, which comes more from the federal government, is that through strings attached to federal grants and federal funding, there are things that cities have to do. So that's sort of the flip side.
Mm-hmm.
The state telling you the things you can't do, and then the federal government saying, here's this money, but you can only have it if you meet certain kinds of water quality standards or wastewater discharge standards. So there's that carrot and stick restriction that comes from the federal government through the grant process.
Yeah, the local recent fight was the plastic bag ban that
Yeah.
The legislature preempted cities from banning the plastic bags.
Right. During my tenure, they also the state legislature started to even though nobody was really talking about this, but they preempted any kind of regulation of oil and gas with the eye towards preventing cities from adopting things like the city of Denton, Texas did, which was to ban fracking within city limits. They also passed legislation which was intended to ban cities from having more welcoming LGBT ordinances and fair housing ordinances than the state level. And it's continued. Many of these conflicts have been more in the environmental area or in some of the sort of what you might say are sort of social legislation, where there's a different mindset maybe at the capital than there is in local government.
All right. So, I think people learn a lot about how the federal government is set up and state governments are kind of similar, but there's lots of variation at the local level on government. So can you talk a little bit about the different ways cities and towns can set up their local governments, and then maybe touch on Norman, since that's where we are. That's where we
Sure.
are.
Yeah. So and a lot of these forms of government depend a lot on when the cities themselves developed and some of the political movements of the day. There are cities that have what are called strong mayor systems. These would look a lot like a state government with a governor or the federal government with a president, where the strong mayor is elected by popular election. The council is a separately elected legislative body. They tend to be partisan elections. And you have, so you have a legislative branch and an executive branch and a judicial branch. And the mayor then is really extremely powerful. There's a lot of variation on that. I mean, where the devil's in the details as far as what powers are there.
Right.
A lot of Western states and Midwestern states that got incorporated or got new constitutions written in the late 1890s and early 1900s adopted what is known as a council manager form of government. And the council manager form of government oftentimes was designed with the idea that small communities might not have either the talent or the institutional capacity to have a strong executive running a city. So the council is a legislative body, which then hires a professional city manager who is really trained to run a multi-million-dollar operation and multi-function. And then the council becomes the policy-making body. Their one employee is the city manager, and the mayor in that situation is typically a member of the council, sort of like a speaker of the council of the legislative body. The other feature that's important about the council manager is that they tended to be nonpartisan. This comes out of the progressive era, the nonpartisan elections, and the idea was really to try to take out some of the corruption that we saw in big cities, in the East Coast, perhaps, or in the the Midwest, like Chicago, had great legendary stories about mayors and corruption. So those are the two main ones. There's a third form that we sometimes see. We saw it in Tulsa for a while, up until the 1980s, which is called the commission form of government. I mean, you can find very few cities that have this now, but it was the idea that you elected a policy-making body, and then each of the members of that commission also had a portfolio of departments that they actually ran. So it would be the commissioner of public safety, the commissioner of environment and utilities, what have you. Anyways, that's tended not to be favored at all, and it's really gone out of practice most places. So, Norman is a council manager form of government, and there have been attempts to try to make government those council elections partisan, and people have really tried to push back on that. You tend to find these strong mayor systems in really big cities, and part of the pressure there is that if you're going to have a chief executive, people want to see that person to be electorally accountable to the citizenry. And so in these larger cities, there's oftentimes this push for the strong mayor system. But for smaller cities, the council, personally, I think the council manager form of government is well suited to delivering good quality services, and yet balancing that with representation and accountability.
Because you sort of in that model, you have citizen legislature, so to speak, and then professionals who are running the services, right? They're trained to do those sorts of things.
Right, and they're trained, and the council, for instance, in the Norman City Charter, the council is actually forbidden from meddling in any personnel matters. And so that professionalism is driven by, technical data, scientific data, good management practices, rather than the council members getting favors asked of police chief to do X, Y, and Z. So, it's again, I personally think it's well suited to smaller cities to be able to run their operations in a professional way.
It's probably worth noting, most people probably don't understand this, that the salaries are probably equal to the level of authority, right? Not necessarily the time people put in. We frequently see, the mayor should give her salary back. It's $100 a month.
Yeah.
You're lucky.
Yeah. So Norman has, this has always been a conundrum. I mean, Norman is really the worst, frankly. Our charter hasn't been changed with regard to compensation for about 30 years. And so that $100 was set at a time where that may have seemed reasonable to the number of hours that people were putting in. But it's not uncommon for a council member to be putting 25, 30 hours, 35 hours a week, if you meet for 11 hours in a council meeting. And, that $100, before taxes. And it also is interestingly tied to whether you're in attendance at the formal council meetings on the second and fourth Tuesday. If you happen to miss one of those, even though you went to every other committee meeting and study session all through the month, you're going to get docked your pay. So I don't know what the compensation is these days in Oklahoma City, but I think when I was serving, the council members were making about $16,000 a year, and the mayor is in the sort of low 30s. I think it's gone up since then. To a certain extent, Norman is an outlier in terms of how low the compensation is. But I think it speaks to this larger issue that for a lot of people in local government, it is about the public service and it isn't necessarily about political ambition.
Right. So let's shift a little bit, still talking about money. So how do local governments generate revenue? And is Oklahoma or cities in Oklahoma special in that regard?
Yeah. Yes and yes. So typically, if you look at local government across the country, there are three sources of revenues. There's income tax, city income taxes. There's the property tax and sales tax. And for many cities across the country, they're able to use all three legs of that three-legged stool to keep a relatively balanced revenue stream. Because we know that sales tax is very cyclical and very volatile. Property tax is less so, but it also is very slow to recover if you're in a downturn. So having the mix of three is really helpful to a city. In Oklahoma, cities have only the sales tax on which to base operations. They can use the property tax for certain capital projects, for buildings and infrastructure kinds of things, but those also require a vote of the people. But the sales tax puts Oklahoma cities in a really difficult position, and particularly now because sales taxes are flat. And I think you're not going to see them recover after this COVID pandemic. I think you're already seeing predictions that 1/4 of the malls in the United States are going to go under as brick and mortar retail goes out of business. So sales tax is real volatile, and for cities in Oklahoma, it also then creates these very perverse incentives to go chasing after businesses that are sales tax generators, even though those sales tax generators may in the long run not be a stable bet. For example, giving tax breaks and incentives to a Walmart because they're a big sales tax generator, but yet they're not a great employer. They're not paying great healthcare benefits, and so you're not seeing household income, going up.
Right.
But for Oklahoma communities, if you can land, one of these, it's great. I like to tell the story of a fellow mayor who was very proud of bringing up Billy Sims barbecue to his community, and because it was going to be one of the big sales tax generators, and they actually gave a sales tax rebate to them, and he saw it as fine because it was also bringing an amenity to his community.
Yeah, I know Tulsa is going after Tesla.
Yes.
Right? And they're probably Tesla's probably just trying to get a better deal from Austin, is my guess. But these businesses, they compete. They make the cities and towns compete against each other.
Right, and the cities and towns, their legal jurisdictions do not define markets. Markets are much bigger or smaller, there's always been this narrative in the city of Norman that, oh, why aren't we more like Moore in terms of bringing in all of these retail stores? Well, Moore happens to be more centrally located to a greater population of South Oklahoma City as well as Norman, as opposed to, the market. If you were geographically to be landing in Norman, that market just does not have the same number of people. So it's the competition for some of these businesses for tax reasons are oftentimes, in my opinion, ill-advised, and in the long term don't pay off.
So assuming cities can generate revenue, where do they spend it?
So the big things, as my description earlier on of delivering service, the biggest expenditure components of the city budget are in public safety and public works. And when I say public works, I'm including in that your utilities like water, wastewater, trash pickup, as well as streets, roads. Between those two, I mean, that ends up being a good, in terms of expenditures, I mean, that ends up being almost 45% or so of your budget. And at least that much, and oftentimes more than 60%. So, I mean, it depends on the city itself, but that's where most of the money is spent, and it's mostly spent on personnel, with the exception of those big infrastructure projects, which are big ticket items, like, replacing your wastewater treatment plant or building new wells and things like that, which are big capital investments.
So you were mayor. What were you most proud of all the things you accomplished?
So, yeah, I mean, I was mayor for 3 terms, which I should get a badge for stamina, if nothing else. I mean, Norman, yeah, Norman, the only other 2-term mayor, you have to go back to the 1990s to get a 2-term mayor. And you have to go back to the 1970s to get a 3-term mayor, and that was a different form of government at the time. So I was mayor for 9 years, and I would say a couple of things. I mean, the things that I almost immediately remember are oftentimes really little things of getting sidewalks fixed. Or made handicap accessible in areas around or even a stop sign in an area around a school district. That responsiveness to constituents and neighborhoods and things that people want is, is really, really gratifying. I think long term, the bigger things that I'm pretty proud of is we persuaded Norman voters to invest in a huge amount of public infrastructure projects. And we had to persuade the voters to do this because we couldn't just raise our utility rates. We not only had to get citizens to approve bond issues for streets, but we also had to get rate approvals so that we could build extensions to the water treatment plant or drill new wells. And, we passed, during my tenure, we passed, I think it was, at one point I had a total for it, but it was, I think we passed a total of about 12 funding initiatives, much of which went to investment in local infrastructure, which will have a really long-term legacy. And so that's not very sexy. It's not very exciting. You don't have your name on a bill. But in terms of quality of life in Norman, I think that the impact will last well into the 21st century.
Yeah, I must say I like the new libraries. They're great buildings, and libraries are great for communities.
Well, and that was so one of the early on in my first term, that was one of the great disappointments, was when we lost the first election for a new library. And I won't go into the politics of that, which were quite complicated. But it was in 2008, and we lost the election by about 280 votes. And it took another 8 years to get the funding secured for that new library. But then, and then we got it off the ground, and not only the central library, but the East Side branch. And it is a great legacy for the city. Yeah.
All right, I'll ask my my wrap-up question. So if you could wave your political science wand, we have these wands,
Yes.
And if people know one thing about government, what would it be?
Well, yeah, what I would want people to know is that not every issue is a partisan issue. And I frankly had some arguments with some council members about these about this thing, and he was a proponent of partisan elections for city council members, and I was not. And part of my argument was that there's one way to. There aren't a Republican and a Democrat way to fill a pothole or to pick up somebody's trash. And I feel that partisanship has become first and foremost, as opposed to people coming together around what constitute good services and good, accountable, and robust participation in local government or in state government, for that fact. So I think the balance has become, we've become way too partisan, hyper-partisan, as we say about the Congress. And that's now filtered down to the state and local government. And I think it's time for people to sort of step back and recognize that the parties are not first and foremost, but rather our commitment to a form of government that we should care about.
Well, all right, thanks. We learned a lot about local government. It's always good to hear from an expert. So thanks a lot, and stay safe.